A president may sense and proclaim that new spirit, but only a people can provide it. You have given me a great responsibility to be worthy of you and to exemplify what you are.
When I asked his son, Jeff, who let me know a couple of days ago that the end was near, I said, if you had to use one word to describe your father, what would it be? And he said, intense.
Yeah.
Well, he was really committed to using his time on earth to advance not just his own interests. He was ambitious for himself, but he was also really ambitious to do good. And that wasn't a phony thing.
Hey, it's Sam Stein, managing editor at the Bulwark. I am joined by the esteemed Jonathan Alter tonight. It is Sunday, December 29th. We're speaking a couple hours after news broke that former President Jimmy Carter had passed at the age of 100. Reason we had Jonathan on is because Jonathan wrote one of the seminal biographies of Jimmy Carter, his very best. I highly recommend it for anyone. I wish I had a copy to show. Unfortunately, I do not. I do in my library in my office, and I have shown it. It's a great book, Jonathan. Look, there's so much to talk about here about Jimmy Carter. I guess. Sort of the nut of the book is just sort of the complexity of the legacy that he left, and the misperceptions of him as either this sort of like inconsequential president or someone who had a better post presidency than presidency. As you look back on his life now that he's passed, but also as you put together this book, what was your main takeaway about why he was so misunderstood?
Well, I think what happens is journalists judge these presidents by how they're doing politically. And he was a political failure. He got, blown out by Ronald Reagan in 1980. And, he had problems communicating. He did make some mistakes. He was not a natural leader. He's not the kind of guy who, like, when you turn around, there are a bunch of people following you up the hill. But leadership is defined in different ways. And Rosalind Carter put it really well when she said, a leader tells people where they already want to go.
Right.
And a great leader tells people where they ought to go, which is much tougher politically to do that, to really think about the future. And so Carter was a political failure who was unfairly demeaned as weak for circumstances largely beyond his control. And because he wasn't bloodthirsty, he was called weak. Political failure, but a substantive and even visionary success. And there's just so many examples.
Right.
Things that he did that at the time nobody cared about or knew about, but that have made the United States and the world better.
I want to get into that substantive success, but let's get through the biography first. His father owned property, but he was born in a area of poverty, but he was not poor. Archery, Georgia, Plains, Georgia. His father, as you write, was a racist. I don't think that's debatable. But his mother also took care of black patients. So there was like a contradiction there. Just describe the upbringing and how that shaped him.
So he really, I think his hard work and just persistence got a lot of that from his father, who he had daddy issues with,
Right.
in part because he was a white supremacist, and Carter, from a pretty early age, just sided with his mother, and he rejected all of that. And he had a third parent, really, an illiterate black woman farmhand named Rachel Clark.
Right.
His mother was off nursing a lot of the time, and so often that the table in their front hall, he and his siblings called Mother, because she would just like leave notes for them. And meanwhile, he's going fishing with Rachel Clark and like learning about God and nature. And there's a shot of him in this Jonathan Demme movie weeping at Rachel Clark's grave in a documentary. And, when I talked to him about Rachel Clark, he was almost brought to tears. So it was a very, very unusual upbringing for somebody a white person in the Jim Crow South.
What stood out to me about, and I don't want to get too Freudian about it, but the father-son relationship, if I read correctly, if I remember correctly from the book, he would sit in silence. The father would make them sit in silence at the dinner table, and they were just. And what was that relationship like? Was he just strict? Did it? How did it affect Jimmy personally and politically?
He was very strict, and there was basically nothing he could do to win his father's approval, which he later wrote poems about. Carter, he had a book of poetry, wrote a novel, he did all kinds of things after he left the presidency. I might, if you want, I can read his various skills. But in answer to your question, I think that he was trying to both live up to his father's uh, work, and not just in business, but in the community. And he left the most exciting tech project of the middle part of the 20th century, the nuclear
Nuclear
navy.
subs. Yeah.
Yeah, to build, they put a nuclear power plant on the back of a submarine before they had them on land. And he worked for Admiral Rickover, and it was super exciting. But when his father died of pancreatic cancer, his father, his brother, and both sisters, they all died of pancreatic cancer. And when he died in 1953, Carter, over the objections of Rosalynn, left this unbelievably exciting program to go back and assume his father's responsibilities. And he realized that his father wasn't as bad as he had thought he was. And there were a lot of Black people in planes who he had lent money to and otherwise helped. And even though he literally wouldn't let them in the front door of his house, it was a kind of a complicated picture of a white supremacist, and, which is hard for us to imagine. But this was a system that they had. Sharecropping is just one step up from slavery. And
Right.
for me, part of the fascinating part of this book was seeing how Carter kind of broke free of this. Although early in his political career, he pandered some to the
Right.
racists in his area. Not
The first gubernatorial one. I'll get to that in a second. But
the
the
second.
second one. Sorry, yeah, he lost the first one. The second one.
Yeah.
I want before we get to the relationship with Rickover. I mean, that's the basis of the title of your book, which was they had this conversation. Rickover is apparently this incredibly intense interviewer, as I recall from the book. He would put people on their toes. He asks Carter why he didn't do better in the Naval Academy, even though Carter had done fairly well. And that's the origins of your book title. Can you tell the story about that?
Yeah, so Rickover would do things like that nowadays would get him fired. There were actually quite a number of people in the Navy, other admirals wanted him fired, and he would do things like he'd say, "Go over, open the window," and the window would be nailed shut. And he wanted to see how these candidates reacted. Or he'd say, "Do something that pissed me off."
And when they would do
Like,
it,
one guy who got in, like, swept everything off Rickover's desk, goes, "You're in," you know?
because it showed an
Yeah,
ability
yeah,
to
yeah.
follow orders.
And he would ask, if you had to choose between a naval officer and a pauper, a shoe salesman in the lifeboat, who would you throw over? And the person couldn't answer that. Is that they're both human beings? No, you throw over the shoe salesman because we need naval officers. This is the kind of guy that Rickover was, but he was also Carter thought he was the most brilliant engineer who ever lived.
Right.
And what he did, Colin Powell believes, won the Cold War because we had nuclear subs and nobody else had. So he asks him, where'd you stand in your class? Naval Academy. Carter says 39th out of 650.
That's
And
pretty damn good.
yeah, and Rickover says, "Did you do your best?" And Carter, who was a brilliant student, and didn't always work well, not always. And Rickover says, "Why not your best?" And then he like wheels around in the chair. The interview's over. And Carter thinks, I
Carter thinks he
didn't
didn't
get
get
in.
it. Yeah.
I didn't get in. And Rickover admired his honesty and let him in. And I argue that, and the reason I call the book his very best, is that for the rest of his life, he never went on Miller time. He never phoned it in. It didn't matter whether he was fishing or making
Right.
peace in the Middle East. He was all in. When I asked his son, Jeff, who let me know a couple of days ago that the end was near, I said, if you had to use one word to describe your father, what would it be? And he said, intense.
Yeah.
Well, he was really committed to using his time on earth to advance not just his own interests. He was ambitious for himself, but he was also really ambitious to do good. And that wasn't a phony thing.
Let's talk about the ambition element of it, because that does, and I want to get your take on this. It does sort of get to the politics, which is you see him described by his contemporaries and the people who worked with him, even the journalists who covered him in real time, as almost Machiavellian in a way, that he was willing to do what it took because he could kind of compartmentalize the morality and the what he felt were the steps he needed to take in order to get to the end. I don't know if you share that assessment, but it obviously, in the second gubernatorial run, he did kind of play footsie with white supremacists down in the South.
Yeah, he did. He did. And I questioned him about it very closely in one of our many interviews. And he finally said, are we done talking about this, John? And I said, not quite, President Carter. I ask you some more questions. So, in his defense, what he would say, and he said to me, is, I never claimed to be part of the civil rights movement.
Right.
And he was late to it. And his view is basically better late than never. And this, he said this publicly in some statements from the Carter Center after George Floyd was murdered. Like, figure out that in your own life that just because you didn't stand up early doesn't mean you shouldn't stand
Yeah,
up later.
but
And I think
did,
he said, so my argument is he spent the second half of his life after 50 making up for what he didn't do in the first half. So just to get to your question,
sure.
he's representing in the Georgia State Senate one of the most conservative districts in the whole state.
Right.
And when he runs for governor the first time, he kind of runs from the left. There really is no left in Georgia politics.
Sure.
He runs a more liberal campaign. He comes close but loses. And he doesn't go as far as Wallace did when Wallace lost, where he said, I'm not going to ever be out-end again, He doesn't do that. And he actually never uses the word. Everybody in his world growing up used the N-word all the time, but nobody ever accused Jimmy Carter of doing it. So he knew the right thing to do, but he wanted to get elected, and he was super ambitious. And he was running against a guy named Carl Sanders, who had been a former governor of Georgia, who'd been term limited, and then was making a comeback. And Sanders was from Atlanta, and he had not just the new black vote, because it was only 5 years after the Voting Rights Act, but also all of the more liberal people in the Atlanta area. So the only way for Carter to win was to appeal to the rural racists, basically. So he had a choice, as he said to me, I could either be governor of Georgia or I could be in the civil rights movement. And I chose to be governor of Georgia. So what he would do is he would say nice things about Wallace, who he later turned on. He'd say, I want George Wallace to come in and speak in neighboring Georgia. Or he went and visited the founder of the Georgia White Citizens Council, which sent a really powerful message. And Carter, for years, kind of tried to cover that up with a story about how when he was in business years earlier in the 50s in Plains, that the members of the White Citizens Council came to him and said, join us. And he goes, no. And they say, well, pay your dues. And he says, no. Then Carter embellishes the story a little bit. He didn't lie, but he did sometimes exaggerate, stories. He says, flush your dues down the toilet. I don't believe he actually did that, but he did not join the local White Citizens Council when,
Right.
by all,
my point was this: is that he clearly played footsie, but obviously with some distance. Yeah. And then on Inauguration Day, he says we have to move past racial segregation. Yeah. So literally, as soon as the deed was done and he had won, and it was okay to finally show your true colors, and you actually feel like racism is deplorable, of course. To me, there was a Machiavellian element to that.
Yeah, no, he was. I mean, he was one of these guys who believed that you shouldn't be political after you get to office, but
right.
You can do a lot of different things to get there. And he did in 1976 when he ran for president.
And his mom called him, I believe, a a beautiful cat with sharp claws. I mean, he was
Yeah,
he could
I have
fight.
a chapter called Jungle Jimmy about when he
Yeah.
was governor, he could be kind of a street fighter. But just the story that you mentioned is so interesting. So he had this guy named David Rabhan, a very eccentric Jewish business guy who later spent years in an Iranian prison. And Carter stayed with after he left office. Carter stayed with this friend. It's a really good friend. He like would dress in like a blue jumpsuit, and he had a Kojak, no hair, and a real character. And he had a private plane. He was very good friends with Martin Luther King, and actually, when King was killed, Rabhan was trying to help the SCLC financially. They were going to go into business together, nursing homes. King was going to go into a whole other really like crazy story. But so he has a, a private plane, a Piper Cub, and he's flying Carter all over the state. And Carter needed that's a big state geographically to get elected. He needed to get to all different corners of the state. He was still an underdog. And so on the last day when it was clear Carter was going to win the primary, which was tantamount to election at that time, he says, David, they're in the cockpit. They're in the plane. There's no cockpit. He says, David, you've done so much for me. Is there anything I can do for you? And this pilot businessman says, yes. And he pulls out the only piece of paper he had was like a back of a flight map. And he says, the time for racial discrimination is over. He writes, he says, sign it and say it in your inaugural address. And Carter
Wow.
does, like 10 seconds into his inaugural address. He says, I say to you frankly, the time for racial discrimination is over.
Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
And we might go, okay, well, is that big of a deal in
Back then it was.
1971? Huge. So
Yeah.
some of his former colleagues, white senators, state senators, they walk out of his inauguration, which had never been, was missed at the time, and is in my book for the first time. They stage a mini walkout. Meanwhile, the black audience members, he said, what? They couldn't believe he had said this. And then he hangs Martin Luther King's picture in the Georgia State Capitol. He never met King, but he became very close to Daddy King and Coretta King. And he just changed. He integrated Georgia state government. Then he moved the federal government from tokenism to real diversity for the first time. And he did all these things that were
Why did
almost
he?
more atonement for him, I thought.
Why did he? To me, there's obviously we've established that he had ambition and a healthy ego, which anyone in politics does. But to go from that point to saying 2 years later, you know what, I should be president. There's a bit of hubris in that. What was it that he felt called to do? Was it just because Watergate and corruption? He was the candidate of morality, and that
He
was
actually
that.
decided before the Watergate scandal came out. He
Okay, so it wasn't that.
decided on the night of the 1972 election, just a year and a
Oh,
half.
okay, so this is pre-Watergate, and he's like, "I'm going to be. I've only been governor for 2 years. I can be president in 2 years."
And that's because in 71 and 72, a bunch of the Democratic candidates for the 1972 nomination, which was won by George McGovern, they came to Georgia and they stayed at the governor's mansion. And Carter took their measure and he said, I'm smarter than these guys. And as governor, I'm better prepared to be president than a senator.
Right.
Because governor is more like being president. And he could be a little bit, arrogant's not really the right term for him. He wasn't sort of cocky the way Barack Obama could be cocky, but he was super confident in his own abilities to engineer problems because he was an engineer and he thought he could engineer solutions. And he'd had real success as governor of Georgia, although I asked him if you had been by the Constitution allowed to run for re-election, would you have won? He said no, because it was similar to when he was president. He would get a lot of important stuff done, but piss a lot of people off in the process.
Well, let's talk about that because most politicians, they have an innate ability to relate to humans. And the sort of predominant theme of his presidency was that he just did not really relate to people in Washington, D.C. He was a consummate outsider. I think he appreciated the idea that he was an outsider, but he's also an incredible micromanager. To the degree that I just was shocked to read, figuring out
So
like you had to clear who was playing on the White House tennis court
yeah,
by him.
that story actually turned out not to be true. That
That's not true.
originally was
Okay.
my friend Jim Fallows, and was one of the things that I had worked actually for Jim Fallows, who was at the Atlantic and now has great substance. And I was his intern, one of his interns in the summer of 1978, when Jim was Carter's chief speechwriter. And what happened was Susan Clow, the president's secretary, she later, even starting then, she would sign his name on
Oh,
and
okay.
so she would put JC next to when say Fallows, who was a tennis player, wanted to use the court. Yes, JC, and Jim understandably thought it was Carter, like approving. It was actually Susan, and but
But the
he
point
did
still stands.
Michael
He did
stuff
have
on.
he did
But
have
this is one
issues.
of the
Yeah,
great
yeah,
myths about him. So
sure.
when not a myth that he did it, but a myth that it was a bad thing. So it actually was a bad thing when he was governor of Georgia, and he just meddled too much. It was bad management because you're basically, you're showing a lack of faith in your subordinates if you're always like messing in their business. And that happened quite a bit when he was governor, and he should legitimately be criticized for it. But when he became president, he would only do that when it helped. So on at Camp David, it was all about like arguing with Menachem Begin about the meaning of very specific words. They were using the thesaurus and dictionary all the time, and going over these drafts that Carter would write. It was real detail work. And a lot of people, including Henry Kissinger, thought, the president should not be doing this because you want to be able to have distance from it if it fails. And Carter was, I understand your argument, but I'm doing it anyway. And it was spectacularly successful. Alaska Lands Bill, which doubled the size of the national park system. He was down on his knees in the Oval Office with these maps of Alaska. And so when Senator Ted Stevens came in and tried to buffalo him, no, this area right here, these are the headwaters, for these species, we can't have drilling right there. And, that's going to be part of the park. And same, even the Panama Canal Treaty, which is back in the news now.
I know.
Was a hugely important accomplishment. When I started, I thought, that's kind of boring, really, the Panama Canal. But, this is the main artery of global commerce. And if Carter had listened to everybody and not moved for ratification in his first term, because it was hugely unpopular, 2/3 of the country was against it, in part because of Reagan, who later supported what Carter did when he was president.
Reagan was bemoaning it on his radio show daily, basically.
Way more than that. John Wayne was for it, but Reagan was, really making hay. He almost won the nomination in 76 on that. And it took a 2/3 vote in the Senate to win. So anybody who says that Carter, was a failure with Congress, it's completely untrue.
Well, let's talk about the misperceptions, because the classic sort of Jimmy Carter caricature is, oh, here's this hyper liberal who just like completely fell on his face. And then your book lays out, and I think it's been more recognized in recent history, that in fact the legislative and policy achievements of the presidency are way more complex than that. 5% increase in defense spending, which helped precipitate the end of the Cold War. A massive deregulation agenda on everything from brewing to interstate trucking. Obviously, there was an energy crisis, but that was not his responsibility. I mean, that came in 73. Obviously, you just touched on the Camp David Accords. If you looked at the record, would you categorize him as classically liberal, or is there something more complex?
Not at all. Okay. No, not at all. So in the 76 campaign, he was running to the right. Only George Wallace, was out to Carter's right. And when Carter beat him in the Florida primary, that was the end of racists in the Democratic Party. And, one of our political parties would no longer accept racists as good standing members of the party, even though some racists continued to vote for them for a while. So, but he was always a moderate Democrat. He ran as a moderate Democrat. and he was really hard to categorize. So yeah, on energy, like liberals got really pissed off at him because he decontrolled natural gas.
Hmm.
And Ted Kennedy was the liberal, and he actually challenged him for renomination in 1980 because
Yeah.
he thought Carter was too conservative. So the rap on Carter at the time was that he was too conservative. Of course, by today's standards, it wasn't conservative, but it was kind of Bill Clinton, New Democrat stuff, right? On deregulation, that actually was not conservative. So he never wanted to deregulate Wall Street. He would never deregulate anything related to health and safety. He added a lot of important regulations at the EPA, but he worked very closely at the staff level. Steve Breyer was Ted Kennedy's staffer, and he worked with the Carter White House to deregulate trucking, deregulate airlines, breweries. So craft breweries were not allowed. It was a crazy old, regulation that screwed the craft breweries, and they couldn't even do business. You know, there was a whole really good deregulatory agenda and trucking deregulation. It sounds boring, but we would not have the economy that we have today without Carter's trucking deregulation because it gave us the just-in-time delivery system. Amazon, FedEx, everything came out of those deregulatory moves.
So the things that he gets hit for the most, obviously, are the Iran hostage crisis situation, and then just absolute runaway inflation. And Volcker, as the Fed chair, raised interest rates to what, 14%? Where did they end up? Higher. Okay.
At one point, they were as high as
Yeah.
19%.
So, reading your book, you come down, I believe, on the side of, well, he got kind of screwed for things that are a little bit out of his control. I think you said one of the big mistakes he made was letting the Shah in for medical treatment. The Rockefellers kind of pushed that on him to do.
Yeah.
Was he a victim of circumstance? Because you could make the case that a president, especially one who was comfortable exhibiting powers of the presidency, may have acted more definitively. May have told Volcker, pound sand. We're not raising interest rates this much.
Well,
Obviously, that would be independence of the Fed and all that stuff. Yeah. But you can make the case that he let the events control him. Where do you come down?
Oh, yeah, that's the argument that he was weak and let events control him. I think that's just wrong for a variety of reasons, but just on inflation. So
Right.
this is an example of Carter doing what was right rather than what was politically saleable. So like Jerome Powell,
Right.
Volcker believed that the way to end inflation, double-digit inflation. So we think inflation was bad a couple of years ago. It was so much worse, and it had its origins, with OPEC having the United States over a barrel, like,
Right.
and so and then the Iranian Revolution, all the Iranian oil fields went offline, and so the price of energy just shot through the roof. And Carter was doing everything he could to get us our first ever energy policy, and but also um, to try to get some energy independence like we have now, but you can only start the process.
Right.
And so to try to tame inflation, he knew that Volcker was going to raise interest rates. Volcker, when he was interviewed, said, I'm going to be independent. And then, so Bert Lance heard about this, and Bert Lance by this time had been disgraced. He was back in Georgia. This was Carter's budget director who had some problems and things that he did before he came to Washington, and it became a huge story that William Safire won a Pulitzer Prize for covering, which was kind of ridiculous. Where the drama of Will, the budget director, and very close friend of the president, have to go, consumed a lot of ink. But he's home in Washington. He's not supposed to talk to Carter because they kind of told the press they wouldn't do that. And Carter would, when he'd make a promise like that, he'd keep it. But he did call some of Carter's aides and said, Jimmy is mortgaging his presidency to Paul Volcker.
Yeah.
Get somebody else. So they found this guy who was the head of the Bank of America, who was a Carter supporter on the West Coast. He later became president of of the IMF, head of the IMF. And this guy was more pliant. And Carter calls him and says, "You want to come, to interview for this job?" And his wife is going like this. They're on their porch at their vacation house. She doesn't want to go back to Washington. And so if this guy had actually taken the job, interest rates would not have gone as high as they did. So what happened was Volcker's very harsh medicine elected and then reelected
Reagan.
Because first it killed Carter because Carter went into the election. People say it was the hostage crisis. That was obviously significant, but he was really sailing into a really stiff headwind, much stiffer than this year.
Yeah.
And I asked Volcker, did you cost Carter the election? And he said, I saw him at a fishing lodge once. Volcker was a big admirer of Carter. And he said, I'm sorry if I cost you the presidency. And Carter smiled and said, there were many factors, Paul. But then the medicine. So at the time when I was a rookie, I was writing these anti-Volcker pieces in 1982, like right after Reagan came in, because it was, it caused a really bad recession.
Yeah.
But it worked.
Right.
So this is something that liberal economists, I think, have now come to terms with, that, this very, very bitter medicine ended up ending inflation. And we didn't have it again until, 2021, Wow.
Yeah.
And so Carter was the victim of inflation. It wasn't his fault. And then he solved the problem ultimately, but it wasn't.
So what were his missteps? I mean, one of the things that people talk about, obviously the Malay speech has been completely misunderstood. It was a success in real time, but then sort of chaotically in a way asking for his cabinet, members of the cabinet to resign. I mean, was the misstep in his public presentation, not being able to kind of soothe and communicate to the American public, not being able to project confidence in a way, making these kind of bold gestures that often would backfire?
Yeah. I mean, yes. And the Malay speech, he never used the word Malays.
He didn't use them, yeah.
Crisis of confidence speech, but it was basically an anti-materialism speech.
Right.
And at first, even like Pat Buchanan, like everybody thought this was
The killer.
a really great speech.
Yeah.
But this is a nation of shoppers. So ultimately, the message was not going to work for him politically. And both Reagan and Ted Kennedy said, this guy is talking down the United States and
Right.
we can make political hay out of that. But the real reason that he was already really down in the polls because of gas lines earlier in that summer of 1979. This was before the hostages were seized. He was at his low point in the polls. He was in the high 20s as people are lined up for gas and they are really pissed off. If you think people were pissed off this past year, 1979, and
they
so
had riots in Pennsylvania over this. I mean, they were burning.
it was crazy. But then to your point, like he does something that I think was really stupid and which he now regrets. When I talked to him, he regretted. He decided it was the time to shuffle his cabinet. And that made him look like he wasn't in control of his own government. So in foreign governments didn't realize, it was the parliamentary system. Did the government fall? Like, why is half the cabinet out?
Yeah.
And he had been very self-critical in his speech. He said things that are like unimaginable now. Like, he'd quote a Southern governor. People thought it was Bill Clinton who met with him, but it was actually Richard Riley of South Carolina. Mr. President, you're not governing, you're just trying to manage,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not leading. I mean, he laid it all out in his speech. It's just mind-blowing in today's terms. And he would criticize himself so much in the speech, but that did eventually look to some people like he wasn't a leader. And he would go charging up a hill, there would be nobody right behind him.
Well, that gets me to the last political point I want to ask you about, which is like, in the end, I think for me, the problem that he encountered was, we have this perception of a president as kind of this all-powerful figure, right? The Green Lantern theory that, if the president wants it done, you can do it. And, to a degree, most, if not all presidents try to act under that idea as if they have that power, but not Carter. I mean, Carter, or at least the perception became that even the president in this case couldn't control the world, that the world was controlling him. Whether or not it was fair, that was his undoing, was that he looked like he couldn't control the events when people
That's true.
want the president to believe, people want to believe that the president can.
That's a fair criticism. His first 2 years, he put so many points on the board. We could talk all day
Yeah.
about what he did, but then his second 2 years, he was kind of swamped by events,
Yeah.
and he didn't, he seemed to kind of shrink, and he didn't, especially in comparison to Reagan, who, had that persona. But
Right.
this is why, so journalists judge these guys by how they're doing politically, and so
Right.
politically, this was all disastrous, but historians need to judge them about how do they change the world, and he wanted, if he'd been reelected, he wanted electric cars by the mid-1980s.
Right.
He was talking about climate change before anybody in the
Yeah.
world, and so these were visionary things, and quite a number of them, the solar panels on the roof of the White House was not just symbolism.
I know.
There were 15 major pieces of environmental legislation that he won, and some of them were very important that let, power plants use clean energy, for instance. They were just using fossil fuel mostly before that, or hydro, nuclear. But all these, like, other sources of energy, they were finally incentivized to
Right.
still be used, and there were a whole series of other things that I won't get into the
Well, I've taken up 35 minutes of your time. I asked for 15. Let's end with a question on the post presidency, because in a weird way, he's kind of he's known almost more for the post presidency. I mean, the presidency was 4 years of his life. The post presidency was what, 50 years of his life?
Yeah.
My math might be
Well, almost, yeah, I mean, he left office in 1981, so it was
yeah. So
43
43 years of his life. Talk about the post presidency, not just, I mean, he did so much around the world in terms of health, but he also pissed off a lot of people in terms of his international diplomacy, angered a lot of people in terms of his advocacy for things like the Palestinians. I mean, he was very outspoken in terms of their plight. How do you think he envisioned his post presidency going? Was this always going to be the case that he was going to do all this stuff, Habitat for Humanity, global health, international relations, or is just as someone who's wired in this way and could not give up doing these types of things?
Well, first of all, the lazy shorthand, mediocre president, great
Great man.
foreign president. You get a lot more done when you have the power of the presidency, but
Right.
he did reinvent the post presidency. And what happened to him is he was depressed after he lost. His wife Rosalind was especially depressed. And in the middle of the night, he woke up and said, why can't I have a Camp David, center here? And that was the origin of the Carter Center. And he turned it into a hugely significant actor in global health and democracy promotion, conflict resolution. And he would piss off his successor sometimes by being what I call the freelance
Yeah.
Secretary of State. But in 1994, he prevented wars in both Haiti and Korea, and did a tremendous number of other things that were significant. On the Palestinians, he was the first one to talk about a Palestinian state or the rights of the Palestinians when he was president, and very outspoken on that, but also the best president for the security of the state of Israel since Harry Truman is.
Well, yeah, the Camp David Accords, and
Because it took
nullifying
the
the Egyptian threat. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and that was a huge, huge accomplishment, the most durable treaty since World War II, and a really fascinating story that I tell in his very best about how he actually pulled that off. And so, I asked his son Jeff, who is the one who alerted me yesterday that his father was nearly gone. And Jeff, said, when I asked him, what's one word that you would use to describe your father? And he said, intense. And Jimmy Carter was not just complicated, not just very smart, but a really intense guy. And he did want to authentically make a difference in as many lives as he could. And the idea of leaving office and playing golf, which he'd given up years earlier, just accepting big speaking gigs, he made his living writing books, and his speaking gigs, he'd give the money to the Carter Center. And, it reinvented what we expect from post presidents. Joe Biden just said that, and Biden was also right, saying that the most important word about him to understand him is decency.
Jimmy Carter lived a life measured not by words, but by his deeds.
Especially in today's context of what we've been through in the last 8-10 years. And there was a core decency, even though it could be personally difficult, it could be cold. And he wasn't, he could play rough sometimes, but not that rough. Not, he wouldn't engage in the kind of ad hominems that we're seeing today. And he told the truth. He actually wasn't a liar. I remember my editor, when I started the book, and I started turning chapters, like, are you really sure you want to say that he didn't lie? And he didn't. I didn't catch him in any lies. He would say things that were, tell some fish stories, but
maybe that was his problem.
you could argue. And he wasn't humble. No president's humble.
No. He was
but he
not
was
humble.
a genuinely modest man in the way he led his personal life. And I do think that his life story, which is a true American epic, is inspirational, and that he will be very, very well remembered, not just in the United States, but around the world, where he's already become a global icon.
All right. Jonathan Alter, I really, truly appreciate this. I know you've been talking about this all night. But look, there aren't as many accomplished authorities on the subject matter as you. Go buy his book. It's called His Very Best. It's really an incredible read and incredibly reported. Jonathan, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. I have great respect for you and for the Bulwark. So
appreciate it.